Hello everyone, we're in the car today for our next episode for our Elkhart County History video series, and we are driving not too far from the museum to Memorial Park in Bristol, because where Memorial Park stands there is a state historic marker which marks the Indiana State Supreme Court case Graves et al. Versus the state of Indiana, which took place in 1848. So what we decided to do is to head out to the marker, talk about it a little bit, and kind of give you some more context of the events that happened, why they are historically significant in the state, and why there is a state historic marker. And actually, we're getting pretty close right here. We're pulling up right to the park. Don't mind the little bumps in the road here. And we have just arrived, so let's get out and we'll stand in front of the marker and talk about why it's here. So here we are in Memorial Park at the southeast corner of Bristol and Division, or 15 and 120, right at the center of downtown Bristol. And here's the state historic marker marking Graves et al. Versus the state of Indiana. And to context the specific events that led to this historic marker, we want to put that in context of a much bigger picture, what was going on in the nation. So in 1847, there's slavery in the South, there's free states in the North. Indiana was a free state, and many enslaved people were escaping the South through Indiana on their way to freedom. And Bristol was believed to be a spot where people would stay. In 1847, there was an event known as the Kentucky Raids, where slave owners or slave catchers would come into Indiana and search for enslaved people that they thought were theirs, where they could reclaim these enslaved people and bring them back to Indiana. So those were, bring them back to Kentucky, excuse me. So those were the kind of the big picture events that were taking place. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to head to where the property where this event took place and talk about these specific events that related to Graves et al. Versus the state of Indiana. All right, so we've moved from Memorial Park to this property behind me, which in 1861 we are on the property of Anna Judson. Anna Judson was married to Samuel Judson, and we believe that's where the event that's made the Supreme Court case in the state take place, right here on this property. Today, you can't see it, but on either side of me, there's actually RV plants. But August 21st, 1847, this entire story and the event begins. Actually, it begins before that with a man named Thomas Harris. Thomas Harris was an enslaved person on the Graves tobacco farm in Boone County, Kentucky. At some point in the 1840s, mid to late 1840s, he escapes, makes his way through Indiana, and arrives here in Bristol. In November of 1846, he is hired by Samuel Judson to work on his property as a servant. So he's working here since in November of 1846. In August 21st, 1847, Thomas Harris is pulled from the Samuel Judson's house by three men: Joseph Graves, a man named Hugh Langmore, and another man whose last name was Coleman. Now, Samuel Judson is awoken to hear Thomas Harris being pulled from the house. Judson makes his way down from upstairs in the home and is confronted by the three men holding Harris hostage. And basically, there's different historical sources. Some say there was a discussion. Some even say Graves pointed a gun at Judson and told him to go upstairs and basically to mind his own business. But Judson does go upstairs. According to many sources, he does not mind his own business. He actually gets dressed, pulls his sword and a musket that he had, comes downstairs. By this time, the four men are out of the house, and Samuel Judson approaches the four men and basically holds a gun to them and tells them to stop what they're doing and to let Thomas Harris free. By that time, Harris is actually handcuffed to one of the men, and Judson, in some historical remembrances, even threatens to use his sword to sever the man's arm to free Thomas Harris from the man. So as this is taking place and Judson is holding the men at gunpoint, Graves, as I can only assume, is yelling and maybe even holding his gun on Judson at that point. Those facts have been lost to history, but people from the town start to gather here, and they gather until eventually there's a fairly large crowd. And Graves kind of looks around and notices that he's outnumbered. It's 3 against We don't know how many people gathered here, but Graves believes he's outnumbered, and he produces a warrant that says that he owns Thomas Harris, and he is in his perfect legal right by the United States Constitution and the laws of the country to come to Indiana to retrieve Thomas Harris and to bring him back to Kentucky. Now, there's still a standoff taking place, and what the men decide to do, instead of coming to blows, which could have easily happened, they decide to go in front of a court where Graves says he will produce this warrant and have the judge decide whether or not Thomas Harris will be allowed to go back to Kentucky or be let free and continue his life here in Indiana or elsewhere. So the story from this property then translates to the courtroom of Justice of the Peace Samuel Gray. So we'll head back to the historic marker and talk about what happened during that court case. So here we are at the back, and so we can show you the back of the historic marker. But as I said, Judson, Tom Harris, and Graves and his two partners decided to take their case into court. So it was heard by Justice of the Peace Samuel Gray. Graves produced the warrant, which he said proved that Tom Harris was his property and that he had legal standing to take Tom Harris back. Tom Harris, during the trial in front of Justice of the Peace Gray, even admitted he escaped from Graves in Kentucky and went on to find his freedom. But looking at the warrant and reviewing the cases of the fact, Samuel Gray deemed that the warrant was insufficient, and Thomas Harris was allowed to be discharged and left the courtroom. Thomas Harris, we believe, went to Michigan to live his life in freedom. So the story continues there, where Graves was actually, and his two partners were brought in front of the Elkhart grand jury. And they were indicted for inciting a riot from the event, for breaking and entering into Samuel Judson's house and dragging Thomas Harris out of the house. They were tried and convicted and were levied a $130 fine. Graves and his two partners weren't there for that trial and actually ended up appealing to the state Supreme Court. The Indiana State Supreme Court heard the case and overturned the verdict, overturned their fine. And there was a very important case. They used precedent that was part of the national legal standing. Prigg versus Pennsylvania was the court case the Supreme Court used. And that story and the history of what happened in that day in 1847 continued to play on through Bristol and Elkhart County history until 2007, when this was installed. So now you know a little bit about why this historic marker was here and the events that brought it about. So we hope we added a little bit more to the story. We hope we added to your understanding of Elkhart County history, and we'll see you next time in our next episode.